Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to greet you all at this meeting of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. This is our 5th annual meeting, and this is our first meeting in person since 2019. So I extend a special thanks to everyone for making the special effort to come to Denver at the present time. We are extraordinarily excited to have our 5th annual meeting feature the book Engaging the Doctrine of Israel, a Christian Israelology in Dialogue with Ongoing Judaism by Matthew Levering. Dr. Levering is the James N. Jr. and Mary D. Perry Chair of Theology at Mundelein Seminary of the University of St. Mary of the Lake. He is the author of over 30 books and the editor of another 20 books. And he's up here telling me about how he's a poor writer. And I've liked Matthew up until this point, but I'm not going to take that at all. No, you're a very wonderfully clear writer and a prolific one to boot. But what particularly is exciting about this book is that it is part of a 9-volume series in Christian dogmatic theology entitled the Engaging Doctrine series. I believe, Matt, this is the 4th in that series, or the 5th? The 5th, okay. So it's significant that a internationally leading Roman Catholic theologian has conceived a massive dogmatic project and has accorded the central volume, if I can put it that way, 5 of 9, to the Doctrine of Israel, a Christian Israelology. We're also very pleased to have a wonderful set of panelists who I will introduce at a later point. The format for our talk is going to proceed in the following fashion. Matthew's going to give a brief introduction to his work. We are then going to hear from our respondents, each of whom will speak for about 12 minutes to a quarter of an hour. I will take the occasion of speaking on behalf of Malka Simkovich, who is one of our respondents, but for personal circumstances is unable to be here in person. Matthew will then have an opportunity to respond to the respondents, and then we'll open up the discussion for general conversation among the panelists and also with you all. So I look forward to a very wonderful conversation, and will you join me in welcoming Matthew Levering?
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And my purpose here in this, my own little introduction is to first say a few thank yous. And then I'm going to offer just a very brief introduction to my book and to the process that led me to the book. So first of all, thank you so much to Kendall, of course, to Mark Kinzer, see him right there, and to the Post-Supersessionist Society, as well as to the panelists. I just feel tremendously honored, tremendously grateful to be here. And I'm just thrilled that you've taken an interest in this book. Now, Kendall's groundbreaking book in Jewish-Christian Dialogue is part of my own theological history. When I was a master's student at Duke Divinity School in 1994 to 1996, Jewish-Christian Dialogue had a very important place and was recognized as crucial for any Christian theologian. I think this sense of the importance of Jewish-Christian dialogue can be traced back to George Lindbeck, one of Kendall's teachers. Maybe you're Dr. Father, I don't know, but sort of my teachers.
opposed to it.
Kendall's The God of Israel and Christian Theology came out in 1996, but of course Kendall had been publishing important work on this topic even prior to that. Now, as an undergraduate at Wesleyan University, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, my own background. I read John D. Levinson's Sinai and Zion, and this book had a tremendous impact on my entire career. Levinson's book became a major source for my doctoral dissertation at Boston College, in which I reframed Thomas Aquinas' soteriology around the categories provided by Levinson. My intention in that dissertation was to creatively retrieve and develop Aquinas' thought in a contemporary theological vein. Now, in other books in the 2000s, I continued to read and interact with Levinson's work, and I should mention other Jewish scholars, such as Michael Wishograd and many others. In 2010, however, I published a book called Jewish Christian Dialogue in the Life of Wisdom, Engagements with the Theology of David Novak. And I'd met David Novak at a conference on John Paul II and the Jewish people in 2008. David's work impressed me so much by its constructive purpose, its serene and generous handling of difficult topics, its wide-ranging acquaintance with Jewish tradition and scripture, its appreciation for philosophy, its ability to speak to a wider audience while remaining focused on a primary Jewish audience, and its commitment to Jewish Christian dialogue. And David Novak became an incredibly important and special friend of mine, but I hasten to add, in the present context, that he is in no way responsible for the deficiencies in this engaging the doctrine of Israel. I didn't burden him with a manuscript prior to publishing it. I did dedicate it to him, but I hope you like that. But he never saw the manuscript before I published it. Our friendship has borne fruit in a volume co-authored with Anfer Iman, titled Natural Law, a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Trialogue, and most recently in a Festschrift, whose contributors were Catholic philosophers and theologians that I prepared for David, where David authored a response to each essay. That's actually the best part of the Festschrift, entitled The Achievement of David Novak, a Catholic-Jewish Dialogue. Let me offer just a little bit more background. My Engaging the Doctrine of Israel belongs to a series, as Kendall mentioned, of interrelated volumes that began in 2013 with a volume on Revelation, and it's also included volumes on the Holy Spirit, creation, and marriage in light of the eschatological goal of the marriage of God and creation. And I'm currently working on the next two volumes, Engaging the Doctrine of Jesus Christ and Engaging the Doctrine of the Church. So this series is something like a quasi-dogmatics, but I should say without any hope of the comprehensiveness, concision, or erudition that one associates with such a project. In this series, though, I've addressed topics about which prior to writing I generally have known far too little. So I got to admit that at the outset. It's been a way of trying to learn about things that I should know about and that I want to learn about. And after the publication of each book, I've discovered an additional wealth of information that I wish I'd known before the book was in print. And in fact, I got an email from this. After this book was published, I got a series of emails from a guy named Arthur Burns. If Arthur was here, I sure would love to meet him. He never responded to it. I kind of was trying to figure out who he was. But he kept sending me like books that I should have included. And things I should have said. And these were, the books he was recommending were wonderful. I didn't know how I missed them, honestly. So I wonder, and then all of a sudden I emailed him back to one thing, when I emailed him back, and it bounced back, and I haven't been able to contact him since. So he may have blocked me. I don't know why. Anyway, so that was something. In Engaging the Doctrine of Israel, I sought to address broader issues of Jewish-Christian dialogue, including such things as the polemical rhetoric or invective of the New Testament, the terrible things that Christians, including Catholic popes, have done to Jews over the centuries, the dreadful Christian denigration of Judaism over the centuries, the enduring election and covenants of Israel,
and how Christians should relate theologically to the state of Israel. I sought to practice a Jewish-Christian dialogue in which Christians were not proselytizing, and in which Christians were not employing the dialogue as an instrument for overturning or relativizing core Christian beliefs. The Christian Doctrine of Israel, in the book I don't attempt to give an account of Judaism, I'm doing a Christian Doctrine of Israel. It involves biblical Israel, aspects of biblical Israel that are constitutive for Christian doctrine as a whole. These include such things as creation, scripture, Torah, temple, land, and king, the Davidic kingship. It's impossible to exposit Christian doctrine without an account of these glorious realities. My book is therefore a work of Christian and specifically Catholic theology, marked by a number of Catholic doctrinal and exegetical commitments. In every chapter, I speak at length about specifically Christian and Catholic realities. Prior to Vatican II, Catholics sometimes proceeded as though Jewish thinkers could make no contribution. By contrast, fortunately, Thomas Aquinas benefited from Maimonides in discussing Torah. I wanted to do something similar, but in such a way as to show deep regard for Jewish thinkers, not merely as contributors to a Christian project, but as great and vibrant theological thinkers whose thought I can appreciate outside of any use that I might make of it. My models among Catholic theologians were such figures as Bruce Marshall, Gavin DaCosta, Gary Anderson, and Joseph Ratzinger. Let me conclude by admitting, I think I already admitted this, but let me admit it again, that my book is limited and expository. Well, of course, the book is sort of too long anyway, so it's limited, but if you try to read it, you might find it too unlimited. But it's exploratory. In writing the book, I was aware that Catholics, both so-called liberal and conservative, Protestants, evangelical and mainline, Messianic Jews, and rabbinic Jews of other Reformed Orthodox and so on, will find a good deal here that needs expansion or invites correction. And so I welcome that. Thank you so much.
I think I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Kendall Soulen. I'm the president of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology, and it's my privilege to introduce our respondents. I don't think I warned my respondents that I'm going to call them in the order of last name, which makes Isaac Oliver our first. Isaac Oliver is Associate Professor in Religious Studies at Bradley University. He earned his PhD in Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan and was a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies in the fall of 2012. Oliver's most recent book is Luke's Jewish Eschatology, the National Restoration of Israel in Luke Acts, with Oxford University Press in 2021. He's currently working on a commentary on the Gospel of Luke for the Oxford Bible Commentary Series. Professor Oliver.
Greetings to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Since I only have 12 holy minutes to respond orally to Levering's impressive monograph, I'm going to focus on just one topic in his book, namely how he deals with the people of Israel. I've shared in writing some further comments on how he deals with Torah and Zionism. First, let me begin with praise for what Levering has set out to do in this ambitious, indeed precious work. Levering is to be commended for his genuine commitments as a Christian theologian to dialogue with what he dubs ongoing Judaism. Judaism did not end in the first century. It is not a religious relic of the Old Testament, but a living tradition that survived and at times even thrived despite the adverse conditions that developed in the centuries after the rise of Christianity. Levering is convinced that Christianity cannot be understood apart from the enduring story of the Jewish people. His engagement with Jewish theology to formulate Christian doctrine is thoroughgoing. This attitude refreshingly contrasts with the anti-Judaic contempt that once viewed, and in some circles still views, post-biblical rabbinic Judaism as devoid of any spiritual life or theological meaning. I also applaud Levering for honestly expressing his personal convictions on sensitive theological matters, even when this might prove controversial. For example, Levering insists that, quote, Christians must affirm that Jesus was and is the Messiah of Israel, and that the rejection of Jesus by the people to whom Paul and the apostles preached was a serious mistake, end quote. Many Jews will take issue with this assertion, I suppose, but those who carefully read Levering's book will sense that he speaks out of personal sincerity. With Martin Buber, though, I agree that the question regarding Jesus' messianic status should be relegated to those irreconcilable differences that divide Christians and Jews. I personally have nothing meaningful to add on this matter, save to underscore the imperative for Jews and Christians alike to agree to disagree on their fundamental differences and to move on to matters that they might share in common. Therefore, when voicing my disagreement with some of Levering's main points, I'm going to try to focus on what I believe can fall within the domain of reconcilable differences between Christianity and Judaism. One possible area for reconciling differences is ecclesiology. Levering believes that the people of Israel is the church, or as he says, Israel reconfigured, messianically and eschatologically. Thus, Levering redefines Jewish identity based on Christian categories. This is evident, for example, when Levering states that, quote, it seems to me that to be in Christ is to be Jewish in a messianically reconfigured way, end quote. To my knowledge, Justin Martyr is the first Christian thinker to proclaim in rather blunt terms that the church is New Israel. An explicit identification between Israel and the church is missing, however, in the New Testament, even in Galatians 3:28 to 29, which Levering quotes to assert that Christians are, quote, now all Israelites, all children of Abraham, in the Messiah, end quote. There is no doubt that Paul considered Jesus' followers, both Jew and Gentile, to be children of Abraham. However, as the Christian tune goes, Father Abraham had many sons. And the sons had Father Abraham. People are saying, I'm one of them, and so are you. But let's just remember, sorry, I'm cutting off now. First time singing at SBL. I'm tenured now. Don't worry about my academic reputation. Let's just remember, though, that not all children of Abraham are necessarily children of Jacob, that is, children of Israel. A crucial question then remains whether, based on Paul's letters and other New Testament documents, whether Christians should be considered Israelites in addition to being Abrahamites. Levering admits that many exegetical debates concerning Paul's writings remain insoluble due to the pliability and relative paucity of the evidence. He accordingly chooses to read the Pauline letters, whether authentic or attributed to Paul, as canonical works in Christian scriptures. Yet, this hermeneutical principle raises questions about which Pauline letter should be granted greater weight for determining the ecclesiological issue at hand. For example, Marcion prioritized the letter to the Galatians by listing it first in his Pauline collection. But in the Orthodox Christian canon, Romans appears at the head of the Pauline epistles and is itself preceded by the book of Acts, which relates the beginnings of a church that was too Jewish in Marcion's estimation. Levering takes the ambiguous phrase in Galatians 6:16, Israel of God, as a reference to, quote, the church, Jews and Gentiles, end quote. However, the canonical and chronological order of Romans and Acts, both were composed after Galatians, might suggest that these be granted the final word for determining the exact identity of the Israel of God, mentioned in Galatians 6:16. Interestingly, Paul never designates Gentile followers of Jesus as Israelites in Romans, even though he believed that they were children of Abraham. They may belong to the seed of Abraham, but not the seed of Jacob. Paul only refers to actual descendants of Jacob as Israelites. Thus Paul confidently calls himself an Israelite from the seed of Abraham, since he descends from Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes. Indeed, Paul even addresses Jews who do not confess Jesus as, quote, my brothers, my kin, according to the flesh, who are Israelites, end quote, Romans 9:4. What about Romans 2, verses 28 to 29? Does it not indicate that Paul redefined Jewish identity to encompass Gentiles? Levin quotes the following English translation in support of that supposition, quote, for he is not a real Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. He who is a Jew is one who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart, spiritual, and not literal, end quote. This translation is problematic for several reasons. First, it omits the concluding statement in Romans 2:29, quote, of whom the praise is not from humans, but from God, end quote. Yet these final words are critical for deciphering the obscure Greek text of Romans 2:28 to 29, which is far from being straightforward, as many exegetes have observed. An alternative translation that fits better with the Greek text and context of Romans would be, quote, for it is not the external Jew, nor the external circumcision in the flesh, but the internal Jew and the circumcision of the heart in spirit and not in letter, whose praise is not from humans, but from God, end quote. One of the strengths of this translation is that it does not use the words real or true, which are missing in the Greek text. Critically, it takes into account the end of verse 29, which underscores the need for the circumcision of the heart. The theme of a new or circumcised heart appears several times in the Hebrew Scriptures, in passages that hardly seek to redefine Israelite identity. Paul's main point in Romans 2:28 to 29 is not that Jews and Gentiles alike, that Jews and Gentiles alike require heart transplants. After indicting Gentile sinners in Romans chapter 1 and possibly chapter 2, verses 1 to 16, Paul begins addressing Jewish transgression in Romans 2:17. The heart of the matter, however, is the heart itself, not Jewish identity. Indeed, right after Romans 2:28 to 29, Paul proceeds to reaffirm Jewish membership in traditional terms. What then is the advantage of the Jew, or what is the benefit of circumcision? Much in every way. Romans 3:1. However, so long as his fellow Jews did not confess Jesus as Israel's Messiah, Paul could not yet affirm that as children of Abraham according to the promise, see Romans 9:8, they benefited from the eschatological salvation he believed came solely through Jesus. Thus, Paul can state that, quote, not all who are of Israel are Israel, end quote, in Romans 9:6, right after affirming in Romans 9:4 that Jews who do not believe in Jesus are indeed Israelites. Israelite identity is not being expanded in Romans 9:6 to include non-Jews. Rather, Paul is distinguishing between Jews who confess Jesus and Jews who do not confess Jesus as their Messiah. Despite their unbelief, Paul maintains that Jews who do not accept Jesus as the Messiah are nonetheless of Israel. In his own words, they are Israel according to the flesh, though not yet Israel according to the Spirit or the promise. For the time being, only a remnant of Jewish Jesus followers, among whom Paul includes himself as a Jew, are Israel kata sarka and kata evangelia. This body of Jewish disciples of Jesus continues to sanctify the rest of the Israelite bunch that is Jewish by flesh or by nature only, thereby guaranteeing the possibility that one day all of Israel can be saved. Paul, therefore, does not confuse Gentile Christians who are children of Abraham with Jews who remain the children of Abraham as well as the children of Jacob. Significantly, this ecclesiological distinction is discernible in several New Testament writings, from the Acts of the Apostles, which assumes that Jews observe the Torah, but demands that Gentiles only keep the apostolic decree, to the Revelation of John, which distinguishes the 144,000 Israelites from the great multitude of Gentile believers. Now, would any of the ecclesiological revisions just proposed prove irreconcilable to Christian faith and self-identity? Ultimately, this question, of course, is left for Levering and other Christians to decide. At least in the ecclesiological refinement just suggested, Israel remains Israel. even if it leaves open to question the Christian belief that Jews should accept Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Yet I have sidestepped that latter question, as it is assignable to the realm of the irreconcilable beliefs that divide Judaism and Christianity. Once again, I thank Levering for approaching the Jewish religion as a theological, informative, and vibrant expression based on the personal conviction, which I also share, that Christianity cannot be understood apart from Judaism.
Our second speaker, well, no, our second respondent is Malka Simkovich, and Professor Simkovich cannot be with us today, so it's fallen to me to read her response on her behalf. I'm going to begin with an introduction. Malka Simkovich is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union. She's the author of The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, and Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures and Stories that Shaped Early Judaism, which received the 2019 Judaica Reference Honor Award. She is involved in numerous local and international interreligious dialogue projects which help to increase understanding and friendship between Jews and Christians. Professor Simkovich writes, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this important panel and by expressing my regret that I cannot join you in person today. I'm especially disappointed to be missing this conversation because I believe that Dr. Levering has forged new ground in theological discourse between Jews and Christians by producing a work that substantially engages with Jewish scholarship of early Christian tradition and contemporary Christian-Jewish dialogue. Levering is also careful to avoid common pitfalls that often dominate discussions of early Jewish and early Christian literature, and that generate imprecise and anachronistic comparisons between these bodies of work. His immersion in contemporary Jewish theology, moreover, engages this theology on its own terms, rather than through the lens of Christian theology. The tension at the heart of Levering's study derives from twin desires: the desire to understand Judaism on its own terms and the desire to understand how Jewish tradition is meaningful in a Christian theological framework. Unlike other theologians who have approached this tension by insisting that Christians have an obligation to engage Jews in dialogue, Levering avoids making demands on the Jewish people. He presents his work as a theological study meant for Christians and examines Jewish attitudes towards law, ritual, Torah, and sacred land, while seeking to undermine the classic binary between Jewish legalism and Christian universalism along the way. The following remarks will focus on one category of Jewish identity, perhaps the most central category of Jewish identity, that Levering believes can enhance Christian faith, the study of Torah. Levering lists 15 affirmations about the Torah's role in Jewish tradition that he believes are endemic to Rabbi Dr. Joseph Soloveitchik's 1983 work, Halakhic Man. And he puts these affirmations into conversation with early Christian literature. These assertions include tenets such as, quote, all this worldly reality must be judged and measured by the Torah. Again, the eschatological world to come will reflect Torah in perfectly full way. And again, Halakhic Man participates in God's work of perfecting the creation. Levering insists that the goal of framing these statements as teachings that are meaningful for Christians is not to achieve a syncretism between the two religions, or to legitimize Christian supersessionism over Judaism. Instead, is only to provide Christians with insight into, quote, the reality of Christ. The analogy between Torah and Christ that Levering develops is prominent in church documents produced after the Second Vatican Council, and seem to me to require deeper analysis. I would therefore like to consider the utility of this analogy and evaluate what is at stake for Christians and Jews who accept it. In recent church documents, such as the 2015 Declaration, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. The notion that Christ is for Christians what Torah is for Jews is scaffolded onto the premise that the Church Fathers' interpretation of Scriptures are hermeneutically comparable to the rabbis' midrashic readings of scriptural tradition. While the rabbis developed an oral tradition that expanded the notion of Torah and retrojected rabbinic theology into biblical history, the Church Fathers read their scriptures as foretelling the coming of Christ. Levering follows the gifts and calling by treating the Christ tradition as a thread that runs parallel to the Torah's oral tradition, and he seeks to put the two traditions into conversation on the basis that, quote, when Christians understand why Rabbinic Judaism values halakha, Christians will better be able to perceive the implications of our affirmation that Christ is Torah. Levering maintains that Torah is a theologically significant category for Jews regardless of its role for Christians and should be understood on its own terms. Yet this disclaimer fails to neutralize the problems that arise when the analogy between Torah and Christ is taken to its full extent. I will begin with the presumption that Jews treat the function of Torah in a way that is comparable to how Christians treat Christ. The question of the role of Torah and even the definition of Torah is massive and controversial and has been addressed differently by Jews living in various locations and eras. In the early modern era, for instance, an entire movement of Jews in Eastern Europe argued that a full encounter with the divine centered not on Torah study at all, but on experiential and mystical modes of contemplation that would give rise to the Hasidic movement. The function of Christ is similarly diverse and evolving. Despite the many permutations of what Torah and Christ even mean, I think a generalization can be made that Christ has a salvific function for Christians that the Torah does not have for Jews. A Jew can live her entire life without studying a word of Torah and still, according to rabbinic thinking, merit salvation. Immersion in Torah does not have the same necessitative quality as faith in Christ. Levering does not explore this point, I think, because he grounds his reading of the Torah's meaning in the work of Dr. Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik viewed himself as a conservator of a particular Eastern European tradition that defined Jewish identity through intensive study of the Torah. Yet over the past 2 millennia, the majority of Jews have not devoted themselves to full-time study of the Talmud. Today, there are more Jews studying the Talmud full-time than ever before. And traditional rabbinic yeshivas that emphasize Torah study in the tradition of 19th century Eastern European yeshivas are burgeoning. Yet, most Jews today still do not study Talmud or the Hebrew Bible on a daily basis. And other Jewish movements, such as the Neo-Hasidic movement that emphasizes the experiential aspect of Jewish spiritual life, are flourishing and growing. The popularity of spiritual leaders such as Rabbi Joey Rosenberg and Rabbi Moshe Weinberger, and intellectuals such as Dr. Ariel Evan Mace and Dr. Shlomo Zucker, testify to the extraordinary thirst for Hasidic teachings in Jewish communities that span the spectrum of observant Judaism. Levering gestures toward this complicated reality when he writes in a footnote that Jonathan Sacks' critique of halakhic man centered on what it lacks. According to Sacks, quote, there is little in halakhic man where there could have been so much, about the delights of intellectual companionship. Levering does not develop this point by considering what Jews today are looking for beyond the realm of Torah study. In the 40 years since the Halakhic Man was published, much has changed in the world of observant Judaism and the classic association between piety and Torah study. Levering also does not explore how centralizing the Torah and Jewish identity presents significant implications related to gender. According to rabbinic legal tradition, women are not obligated in the commandment of Torah study because they are exempt from time-bound commandments. One reason for this exemption is that as the primary caretakers of small children, women cannot structure their daily routine around communal activities such as prayer and text study. The rabbis, moreover, lived at a time when men were active in the public communal sphere and women were mostly limited to the domestic realm. Whatever the reasons for the exemption, the centralization of Torah study to Jewish identity risked the marginalization of women's experiences and their ability to observe an authentic and meaningful form of Jewish practice. The differences between how Christ and Torah function on a salvific level reflect broader differences between rabbinic and Christian theology. Rabbinic Judaism rejects the concepts of original sin, divine grace, and the forgiveness that redeems humanity from sin. It therefore rejects the notion of a mediating entity that enters the physical realm and acts as the instrument of forgiveness, although both Jews and Christians played with the concept of logos during the Roman period. Yet the central claim of rabbinic Judaism, I think, is not about the Torah. It is about the message concerning the election of Israel that the Torah bears witness to. For the rabbis, the Torah is a fluid collection of written and oral memories that engage with this election and God's relationship with Israel. Torah study may be the dominant medium through which Jews affirm their election, but it is not the sole medium. I wonder whether contemporary Christian theologians have been inclined to minimize the role of election in Jewish theology because they are uncomfortable with the ways that church leaders have associated the Jews with election claims with accusations of Jewish misanthropy and chauvinism. Sensitive to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, these theologians prefer to sidestep how central election is to the rabbinic imagination. It is also possible that some of these theologians are not worried that Christians will continue to misunderstand and critique election, but they themselves continue to be uncomfortable with the notion of chosenness. The categories of Christ and Torah also differ in terms of how they operate as directional mediums between God and the people. If the path between God and humanity is a highway, then Christ is the soteriological medium that drives on one side of the road, deriving from God and flowing down to humankind. Torah, however, travels in both directions. The biblical writers present God as writing words of Torah and directing Moses and other prophets to transmit these words to the people of Israel. But the rabbis expand Torah to include teachings that are produced by people and are merely sanctioned by God. This radical innovation finds expression in the Talmudic oven of Achnai story, in which Rabbi Joshua rebukes his colleague, Rabbi Eleazar, for proving his legal position by evoking divine intervention, when the determined practice is, quote, not in heaven, but in the hands of the rabbis. While the rabbis imbue themselves with extraordinary authority, and recognize the chasm between their world and the realm of the divine, Christ enters the physical realm, but is not of it. Where Christ embodies transcendent and perfect truth, Torah is fluid, evolving, multivalent, complex, and even vulnerable to error. Levering conscientiously clarifies that the analog between Torah and Christ is imperfect. But had he further explored how the differences between Christ and Torah reflect broader differences between Christians and Jews, he could have strengthened his goal of avoiding supersessionism by affirming the boundaries that separate these traditions. The questions that I have raised in these remarks should not detract from the fact that Levering's work is extraordinarily significant. His intolerance for supersessionism and simultaneous desire for Christianity to encounter Judaism on its own terms have the potential to help Christians and Jews enter a new stage of relationship wherein Christians reject a theological model that subsumes Torah under Christ and abandon all expectations of theological transactionalism. For his work and for all of the work that it will generate, I extend Dr. Levering my thanks. Our third respondent is Professor Matt Tapie. Professor Tapie is Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Leo University, St. Leo, Florida. His teaching and research interests are in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, Judaism and Christian theology, and Catholic-Jewish relations. Professor Tapie is currently writing a manuscript entitled Spiritualis Uteris, the Mortara Affair and Thomas Aquinas' Defense of Jewish Parental Rights. Professor Tapie.
Many thanks to the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology for the invitation. I'm honored to be on this panel with such esteemed scholars, and I look forward to learning from all of you. Matthew Levering's Engaging the Doctrine of Israel is the most constructive Catholic theology of the Doctrine of Israel to date. Several features stand out. First, I'm aware of no other Catholic theological work that undertakes such a broadly constructed dogmatics by placing modern theology at the center of the inquiry and with attention to Christology. Matthew's project puts Christology in conversations with topics such as temple, land, Exodus, kingship, and Jewish Christian dialogue, topics that usually do not have a place in dogmatics. Second, Matthew not only puts central topics in modern Jewish theological reflection at the center of his dogmatics, he also engages these themes in a positive and sensitive way. Another feature of the dogmatic work is the extensive engagement with scholars of Jewish Christian relations and biblical studies. Matthew's reflection unfolds in conversation with the positions of leading scholars in these disciplines. It seems to me that the footnotes alone constitute an annotated bibliography of theological questions in Jewish Christian relations. The most notable feature of the book, in my view, is Matthew's theological engagement with modern Jewish thinkers, such as David Novak, Rosenzweig, Heschel, Sachs, Soloveitchik, and others. Matthew's method here is groundbreaking. I know of no other Catholic dogmatic project that engages such a range of Jewish perspectives at this theological depth. On this point, Matthew's book can also be seen as a part of an evolving tradition of Catholic theological dialogue with Rabbinic Judaism. One question that I would like to examine in more detail in the next several minutes is whether the argument of the book is successful with regard to just one topic, the concept of invincible ignorance. This classic Catholic moral theological category is used for the purpose of trying to provide a Catholic theological ground for Jewish religious practice after the Passion of Christ, which is highly significant given the standard Christian approach to post-biblical Judaism. In contrast to the standard condemnatory view of the religious life of Rabbinic Judaism, Matthew argues that Christians should affirm Jewish religious practice today despite Christ's fulfillment and reconfiguration of that practice around himself in the sacraments of the Church. Why should Christians affirm Jewish religious practice today in light of Christ's fulfillment of the law? Because Christian violence against the Jewish people, which he helpfully labels Gentile failure of boasting, a reference to Romans 11:18, has obscured the gospel from view. This is a highly significant part of the book, in my view, because for most readers, Christian theologians included, the history of Christian violence against Jews and Judaism is unknown. Indeed, the misperception caused by the abuse and polemic of Christians against Jews is defined as, quote, the hardening of Israel, mentioned in Romans 11:25-6, verses which read, now quoting Paul, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, a hardening has come upon Israel. Matthew writes, when Christ is proclaimed to the Jewish people, what they often hear is not Christ, but slander, end quote. Since the identity of Jesus has been obscured, the negative view of Christ among most Jews is understandable, and there's no culpability for this. Therefore, Christians should affirm the goodness of ongoing Judaism efforts to obey its covenantal obligations and support our Jewish neighbors in their practice of their Jewish religious life. In Catholic moral theology, the language of vincible and invincible ignorance can be a little confusing. It provides a way of evaluating blame in situations where people act in good faith but have an erroneous conscience, i.e., they are wrong about what they think they should do, and so they act wrongly as well. To try to illustrate, say you were driving down a road and are pulled over by the police. The officer says you were speeding through a school zone, doing 45 and a 25. You respond that you were acting in good faith and did not know it was a school zone, so you should not get a ticket. But of course you're going to get a ticket. As a driver, it's your responsibility to know the speed limit and to keep an eye out for signs. You really thought the limit was 45 and you acted accordingly. This is a simple example of following your conscience when it is wrong, or an erroneous conscience. The ignorance about the speed limit is vincible, meaning that the ignorance was able to be overcome because you should have paid attention to the signs. And so you're indeed morally responsible for not knowing better. You acted wrongly but should have known better and so are blameworthy. But perhaps you were paying attention, and the last sign you saw did indeed read 45 miles an hour. Since no new sign appeared, you assumed 45 was still the limit. It turns out there was a school zone sign marking the change to 25, but when you go back to check, you see that the sign had been knocked over for some reason. So now note, you were still speeding and violating the law. The question is not whether you violated the law, you did. The question is whether you're blameworthy for that violation. In this case, you truly had no way of knowing the law. You acted wrongly, but are not blameworthy, since you had no net access to the knowledge. Invincible ignorance means you're not blameworthy because you did not have access to the necessary information, and there was no way to get access to the information. Vincible means you're blameworthy because you could have gained access to the necessary information for acting rightly. So it seems on this logic to be in a state of non-culpable, invincible ignorance with regard to unbelief in Christ, i.e. to be wrong about Christ and not blameworthy, an unbeliever must have no access to teaching about Christ. Or, as Matthew has pointed out, the understanding of Christ could be distorted by Christian boasting and polemic. Some have no knowledge of Christ, or their understanding of Christ is distorted by a memory of Christian violence. And so on this logic, although they are mistaken to practice Judaism after Christ comes, they are certainly not blameworthy for this. However, in a Jewish-Christian dialogue, both sides can indeed distinguish the Church's claims about Christ from the history of Christian violence. And this is where I start to see maybe that the idea of invincible ignorance may not be as helpful. Some Jewish scholars can and do obviously reject the claims about Christ not because of the history of Christian violence, but because they have a different interpretation of Scripture and the character of the Messianic era. There is a disagreement between most Jews and Christians about the Church's claim that Christ is God. And so this is not about misperceptions, but this is about theological reasons. Therefore, it seems members of the Jewish Catholic dialogue do not meet the criteria for invincible ignorance because they understand and disagree with Christological claims. Matthew seems to acknowledge the difficulty in a few places when he mentions the idea of a culpable rejection. Although the aim is the construction of a well-intentioned, positive ground for Jewish practice, which is highly historically significant to make that move, it seems Jewish Christian dialogue itself is placed on slightly shaky ground. Moreover, it seems to me that the use of invincible ignorance could obscure a fundamental question faced by the Council Fathers at Nostra Aetate. The question was, are the Jewish people pleasing to God apart from Christ? For Karl Thiemann, who was one of the architects of Nostra Aetate, the breakthrough idea, which he realized in heated exchanges with letters with Mark Luber, was that the Jew is pleasing to God precisely as a Jew. It is important to say that Matthew stresses throughout his book that God wills ongoing Judaism. He writes, God's plan involves for positive reasons the existence of ongoing Judaism until the coming of Christ in glory, that is, until the end of time, end quote. God's plan includes ongoing Judaism. A Christian can see in rabbinic Judaism positive goods that God has providentially willed. And yet, if God intends the cessation of Torah in its original mode, how can God also will that Jews and Judaism continue until the coming of Christ in glory? How can God will that A, Judaism no longer be practiced, and B, that Judaism continue? Perhaps another way of framing would be to think about another way of building Christian affirmation of Jewish religious practice after the Passion. Could become clear if we slightly adjust the lens on our reading of Romans 11, verse 25 through 6, which, as we said before, is frequently interpreted as a hardening of Israel. As is well known, standard translations render the verse something like this: I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers, so that you will not become wise in your own estimation. A hardening has come upon Israel in part, until the full number of the Gentiles come in, and thus all Israel will be saved. End quote. The problem with the standard translation of hardening is that it shifts the theological spotlight to a negative disposition, whether ignorance, blindness, resistance, in the Jewish people. On this reading, God seems to only permit Judaism to continue as a well-intentioned but mistaken enterprise. When this subjective epistemic disposition is read into the verse, it distracts from what I see as the overarching point, that it is actually a sort of unbelief in Gentile Christians that Paul is concerned about. Unbelief in what? Unbelief in Paul's warning that there are positive purposes in God's election of the Jewish people in the era of grace. Another way of interpreting Romans 11:25 helpfully shifts the focus from Jewish disposition to Christ to a focus on the necessity of Gentile Christian awareness of the election of Israel. Mark Nanos translates verse 25 as follows, quote, "For I do not want you to be unperceptive, brothers and sisters, about this mystery, so that you would not be mindful only for yourselves, because for a while a callous has formed for the protection of the injured branches of Israel until the fullness of the nation shall commence." Nanos argues that porosis, from poroo, traditionally translated as hardening, evokes the idea of Pharaoh's hardened heart. But Paul actually does not use the Greek word for Pharaoh's heart in Romans 11:25. Rather, the word he uses, poroo, which is actually a medical term referring to the formation of a callus to protect a wounded limb. A callus involves a type of hardening that is not a negative attribute, but a protective and healing attribute. Unlike the negative case of a hardening of a heart, a callus on a damaged limb promotes healing, protecting the injured area so that life can be conducted in and through it, thus serving the interests of the overall body of a plant, so that it can be restored, saved, healed, and rescued. This interpretation of a protective and healing callus upon the Jewish people provides a coherent theological foundation for affirming that Rabbinic Judaism is positively willed by God despite Christ's fulfillment, or alongside of Christ's fulfillment, or in Christ's fulfillment of Torah. A callus is formed on Israel because God is protecting them. From what? The painful division among Jews and Christians in the first century over the announcement of the gospel to the nations, and as Matthew points out repeatedly, the secondary cause of the nation's boasting against Israel. The mystery of the callus shifts our focus to the necessity of Christian belief in God's care for the Jews in the time before the second coming. The concept of the protected callus combines God's positive will with distinctive Jewish existence now. This protective healing is an act of God and is for a time determined by God for a while, as Paul says. As Matthew says, St. Paul perceived that this situation is a mystery in which the divine will is inscrutably involved. In the era of grace, a protective callus or fence around the Torah is formed, so that the life of the Jewish people can be conducted through it until the fullness of the nations commences. Therefore, a permanent distinction between the church and the Jewish people in the era of grace is defined positively, yet with a view toward unspecified eschatological unity. Indeed, Matthew recognizes the importance of a permanent distinction between Jews and Gentiles in his chapter on Torah. And it is a place where it seemed to me that Matthew's positive theology of the Jewish people converges with the line of reasoning in Wisharad and in Kendall Soulen. Matthew writes, quote, "I affirm that God's choice of the Jewish people and the distinction between Jew and Gentile that it entails are an abiding part of God's positive purpose in the world, irrespective of the posture Jews may take toward the church's claims on behalf of Jesus of Nazareth." The dominant theme of Matthew's book is this constructive and positive theology of the ongoing significance of the Jewish people. For this reason, I think his work significantly deepens Catholic theological understanding of the election of Israel, and at the same time swings open a door for deeper conversation between Jewish-Christian dialogue and Catholic systematic theology.
Our last respondent is Professor Susannah Ticciati, who is Professor of Christian Doctrine at King's College, London. Her research interests encompass constructive Christian doctrine, biblical hermeneutics, apophatic theology, and the practice of scriptural reasoning. Her most recent book was published this year and is entitled On Signs, Christ, Truth, and the Interpretation of Scripture. Professor Ticciati.
Hi everyone. Huge thanks to the Society for inviting me to speak today. I'm really honoured to be on this panel as well, and delighted to be here with you. And I'm also delighted to have the opportunity to respond to Matthew Levering's tone, engaging the doctrine of Israel. In the context of the various literatures engaged with questions of Christian supersessionism and anti-Judaism, as well as that of Jewish-Christian dialogue, the need for specifically Christian Israelology has become pressing. And this book provides one in spades. Why is it pressing? The book is its own advocate in this connection. In developing a Christian account of Israel, it displays the fact that Israel, far from being a term with a self-evident meaning and reference, is a term of theological art. Abstracted from any particular context of use, it is underdetermined. A non-reflexive usage, which unthinkingly then fills in the blanks, carries the dangers of essentialization, projection, othering, co-option, and supersession, many of which have been present in Christian uses of Israel to denote an outdated Jewish people. To avoid these dangers, Christians must, for their part, distinguish what might be meant by Israel within a Christian context from what it might mean for Jews. Levering speaks explicitly and self-consciously as a Christian, and more specifically as a Roman Catholic. He makes clear that his doctrine of Israel is not intended as something that might accord with Jewish self-understanding. In keeping with an underdetermined Israel, Levering follows Joseph Ratzinger and George Limbeck, among others. Can I just check that the volume's all right for you all? In highlighting the fact that the biblical story of Israel has several continuations. More specifically, he notes, this time citing David Novak, that, quote, both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism come out of and thereby supersede a religion based on the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Jewish theology. Thus, if Christians claim, as Levering affirms, that they are, quote, the messianically reconfigured Israel, end quote, such a claim is not the negation of a Rabbinic Jewish Israel. Rather, Jewish and Christian Israels are simultaneous bids to be the successor of an underdetermined biblical Israel, each living out its story along theologically different trajectories. The meaning of Israel, in short, is not neutral, but theologically freighted, gaining its meaning only and variously by way of such specific theological determinations. A significant upshot of this observation, as Levering acknowledges, is that a Jewishly defined Israel is not internal to, but external to Christian theology, developed along its own trajectory. If Christians develop their own Christian theological account of Jews and Judaism, the place carved out for Jews or Jewish Israel in that account cannot be expected to map onto a Jewish Israel in Jewish self-understanding. If Christians are going to learn from Jews and or to disagree with them, then they must engage with Jewish thinkers in their own right, rather than projecting onto them from the way in which Jews figure in their own scriptural and traditional sources. In other words, one must distinguish between Christian thought about Jews and Christian dialogue with Jews, or, to put it slightly differently, Jews internal to and Jews external to the Christian vision. In keeping with this distinction, Levering spends a large proportion of the book engaging with a good number of recent Jewish thinkers, as being pointed out and praised, and I would also praise this aspect of the book. Moreover, his very choice of themes, especially Exodus, Torah, Temple, and land, is implicitly informed by Jewish-Christian dialogue. By the same token, Levering does not shy away from robust disagreement with his Jewish interlocutors. Inhabiting different intellectual trajectories, it is to be expected that Christians and Jews will make conflicting truth claims, doing so in accordance with the different criteria internal to those trajectories. Just as Levering's Christian commitments entail his standing by certain truth claims, so his Jewish interlocutors' Jewish commitments do the same. To respect this fact is not the same as giving up on one's own claims, nor indeed on the truth, and he's extremely clear about this, and I think helpfully so. But it is to recognise, rather, that others may have a different and differently justified take on the truth. To this point, as you can probably hear, I'm in full accord with Levering. Indeed, I welcome his book as a sophisticated and timely contribution to a fraught theological landscape. However, on my reading, he doesn't pursue these insights quite far enough. And in not doing so, he leaves room for the development of another strand of argument that pulls, I will argue, in a different and conflicting direction. This may indeed be a sign of the book's wonderfulness. As Peter Oakes has said, such conflict is sometimes the sign of a profound thinker, because it signals someone who's not content with the present conventions and is therefore attempting to transform them. Thus, the critique that follows should be taken as a testimony to what I see as the great merits of Levering's work. So, within this second and conflicting strand, Levering makes judgments from his own Christian standpoint about Jewish truth claims, judgments that are not warranted if it is accepted, as just elaborated, that Christian and Jewish truth claims are made according to different criteria, and thus cannot be judged with respect to the criteria drawn from the other tradition. The reason he's able to do so, I'll suggest, is that he doesn't maintain quite strongly enough the distinction that he otherwise does draw between Jews internal to the Christian vision and Jews external to it, but maps one onto the other, thereby casting his Jewish interlocutors in a Christianly conceived mould. The conflicting strand is encapsulated in the pregnant phrase, Ongoing Judaism, which is a weight-bearing category throughout the book, as well as appearing in the subtitle. Ongoing suggests unbroken continuity with the past. And Levering makes this suggestion explicit. He claims, for example, citing this time Michael Visegrad, that, quote, the Judaism of the rabbis is not fundamentally discontinuous with biblical Judaism, end quote. More strongly still, he asserts that, quote, Jews grounded in belief that the Messiah has not yet come believe that God's covenants with Israel, the Jewish people, continue unchanged. I think that's a very strong claim. He does so despite having affirmed with Novak that Rabbinic Judaism, as much as Christianity, supersedes a religion based on the Hebrew Bible. Concretely, in his chapter on the Temple, he acknowledges that the spiritualization of the cult among Jews as well as Christians, he acknowledges the spiritualization of the cult among Jews as well as Christians, the practice of animal sacrifice being replaced in the former case by prayer and the study of Torah, and in the latter case by the body of Christ and the Eucharist. True, he argues against displacement in favour of fulfilment, but nevertheless radical change is evident within both traditions. Having cast Jews today in unruptured continuity with biblical Israel, Levering can simply equate Israel with the Jewish people. By contrast, while he talks about Christians as, quote, eschatologically reconfigured Israel, end quote, opening up the possibility of a parallel continuation of biblical Israel in the church, because he's already equated Israel with the Jewish people, the church can only be identified as the new Israel. By default, the Jewish people become the old Israel, the people of the old covenant, which, Levering affirms as a Christian, has not been revoked. But this, to my mind, is to map Judaism onto the Christian Old Testament, despite the important recognition that post-biblical Judaism, as much as Christianity, are innovative phenomena with respect to the Hebrew Scriptures. And insofar as the Old Testament is itself a Christian construct, to identify the people whose story it tells with Jewish people is straightforwardly to cast Jews in Christian mould. It's this casting that allows Levering to make Christianly framed judgments about the Jewish people. The core argument of his book, and we've heard a little bit about this from Matt, is that in respect of Torah, temple, land, kingship, in kingship. In fact, sorry, Matt, we're coming on to your bit in a minute. Christ fulfills and transforms, but does not negate or revoke the covenant made with Israel. Because the Jewish people, scandalized by their treatment at the hands of Christians, are as a whole invincibly ignorant in respect of the messiahship of Christ, they cannot be judged to be culpable in their rejection of him. More precisely, and moreover, precisely because they cannot know better, quote, the ongoing Jewish people remain obligated to the original form of the unrevoked covenant. Christians are, on Levering's account, in the odd position both of knowing better and of being required for Christian theological reasons to support the Jewish people in its keeping of the old covenant, including, for example, by dwelling in the promised land. Jews in this account are subject to Christian judgment, whether affirmative or negative. In short, by equating Jews with the Israel of the Christian Bible, Levering makes them internal to the Christian vision, losing sight of their externality to it and making it possible to judge Jews on Christian terms, something that I think he otherwise wants to avoid doing. This conflicts, I would argue, with the insight expounded earlier that Jewish traditions, as much as Christian ones, unfold along their own different trajectories and according to their own logics. To judge Jewish ways of life in terms of a Christian logic is, on this account, nonsensical. It is to presuppose a conceptual and practical mapping that cannot be assumed to exist. And actually, I think Malka's getting at something of this when she's thinking about Torah and Christ as perhaps not inhabiting exactly the same position in each tradition, and therefore the analogy becoming shaky. So, to make these kinds of mapping is to presuppose a conceptual and practical mapping that cannot be assumed to exist. If piecemeal parallels are to emerge, they will do so rather on the basis of dialogue in which different Christian and Jewish patterns of reasoning are allowed to surface and thence be explored. Given that the traditions are not tightly sealed off from one another, but have grown up in constant interaction, one can expect to find resonances and contrasts beyond mere incommensurability. And on the basis of continuing dialogue, one can hope for continued borrowings and cross-fertilizations. But these cannot be presumed nor stipulated in advance. Having argued against the straightforward equation between Israel and the Jewish people, I've implicitly made a case for a Christian use of Israel that includes, not necessarily exclusively, the church of Jews and Gentiles. And this is to go somewhat against Isaac's reading, so I'm interested to take this disagreement a bit further. Levering speaks of the eschatologically reconfigured Israel, and I would follow him in this with the proviso that this is not a new Israel, leaving behind an old, but is part of the Christianly understood continuation of biblical Israel in the light of the coming Christ. Christian and Jewish, among potentially other Israels, are historically contingent and creative determinations of an underdetermined Israel. To recognise this is to ward off both projection, for example, onto a Jewish other, and essentialisation, for example, of Israel in ethnic terms. Having heightened the non-translatability or incommensurability of Christian and Jewish Israels, I return to Levering's admirable commitment to the making of truth claims, even in the context of Jewish-Christian dialogue. While he, quote, affirms that we should be open to other perspectives that arise from seeing things from new angles, end quote, he does not, quote, hold to an eschatological deferral of truth or certitude. He wants the certitude now, or some kind of certitude, and I want to know a little bit more about what kind. This, he says, in departure from the position of Randy Rashkover, which he has otherwise affirmed. For Rashkover, the Christian's freedom to make truth claims entails the same freedom on the part of her Jewish interlocutor to make alternative truth claims. But it follows that the gift that frees me to speak the truth, a gift which is not exclusively mine, also frees me to admit that I might be wrong. Which sounds very simple, but actually it's quite a hard thing to do. In Christian terms, we know by faith and not by sight. The certitude Levering wants for his Christian claims goes together with his confident judgment, whether affirmative or negative, of Jewish claims. Both, I suggest, are an overstepping of finitude, inhibiting both the ability to admit to being wrong and the ability to learn from another's finer perspective. Short of the eschaton, our certitude can only be a fallible certitude. On the other hand, coming back to what I think is one of the great positives of Levering's book, this is just the kind of certitude he in fact enacts in the book more widely. Thus, while I've ventured a critique of one strand of his work, and it is just a strand, I hope it's come across as a reparative critique by which I seek to affirm its broader trajectory. So thank you very much.
At this stage, my job is to make some I'm supposed to make some intelligent remarks that show you that in fact I really do have a response to all these wonderful criticisms, but I'm really not sure that I do. Fundamentally, this is my opportunity to thank Professor Simkovich, Ticciati, Oliveira, and Tapie, and I apologize for mispronunciations. I owe each of them a very large debt indeed. It's not possible for me here to answer all the concerns they raised or follow up on all their instructive insights. I don't presently possess the answers to all their concerns, and I anticipate that in various ways I will need to refine and adjust my thinking. Another task will be to integrate into my own thought their constructive insights, where they go beyond the confines of my book and add much that is rich and helpful. Professor Simkovich suggests that my book is, quote, careful to avoid common pitfalls that often dominate discussions of early Jewish and early Christian literature, and that generate imprecise and anachronistic comparisons between these bodies of work, end quote. She also suggests that my, quote, immersion in contemporary Jewish theology, moreover, engages this theology on its own terms, rather than through the lens of Christian theology, end quote. I'm grateful that she's appreciated my intentions in these respects. She adds that my book incorporates, quote, twin desires, the desire to understand Judaism on its own terms, and the desire to understand how Jewish tradition is meaningful in a Christian theological framework, end quote. Now, I don't dare to claim that given my limited knowledge, I could, quote, understand Judaism on its own terms. But I did have the hope, and this is likely what Professor Simkovich is getting at, of understanding some important contemporary Jewish texts as much on their own terms as I could do, given the limitations of my knowledge. I sought to enable some notable texts to speak in their own recognizable voices, rather than subsuming them immediately into my own constructive voice, although I'm sure I did eventually do the latter for my book's constructive theological purposes. I focused especially on Rosenzweig and Heschel for Chapter 2 on creation and Scripture, Jonathan Sachs for Chapter 3 on Exodus, Joseph Soloveitchik for Chapter 4 on Torah, Jonathan Klawans for Chapter 5 on Temple, and David Novak on Chapter 6 on land and kingship. Regarding what Professor Simkovich identifies as, quote, my desire to understand how Jewish tradition is meaningful in a Christian theological framework, End quote. I wish to insist that a Christian theological framework does not evacuate Jewish tradition of its meaningfulness or of its spiritual fecundity and vibrancy. Although I cannot claim to know Jewish tradition well enough, I'm certain that the Jewish thinkers whom I treat are immensely meaningful, both in their own contexts within Jewish tradition, and also in what they can contribute within my framework of Christian theological reflection. Now, Professor Simkovich raises a number of concerns about my understanding of Torah and its place in Judaism, and the comparison I make to how Christians understand Christ. I agree with her that it is a deficiency in my chapter, that I was not able to investigate Judaism's understandings of Torah more broadly. Instead, I set up the chapter as a dialogue with Rabbi Soloveitchik and cited a few other Jewish and Christian scholars. So I did not intend to offer a full-scale account of Judaism on Torah or to compare Judaism and Christianity in a rigorous fashion. Now, Professor Ticciati, again, I know I'm mispronouncing.
It's pretty good.
Okay. Correctly observes that I hold, quote, a Jewishly defined Israel is not internal to, but external to Christian theology, developed along its own trajectory, end quote. This means, as she says, that, quote, if Christians develop their own Christian theological account of Jews and Judaism, the place carved out for Jews or Jewish Israel in that account cannot be expected to map onto Jewish Israel and Jewish self-understanding, end quote. As she says, this also means that, quote, if Christians are going to learn from Jews and or to disagree with them, then they must engage with Jewish thinkers in their own right, rather than projecting onto them from the way in which Jews figure in their own Christian tradition, or Christian, in the ways in which Jews figure in their own scriptural and traditional sources. End quote. Is it possible for Christians to make judgments from a Christian standpoint about Jewish truth claims? Professor Ticciati raises this important issue. From my standpoint, as a Catholic theologian, I prefer not to make judgments about Jewish truth claims at all, unless they have to do specifically with Christian truth claims, such, just to give a couple examples here, as whether Paul was correct that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel, or whether, for example, the New Testament is divine revelation. To my mind, and so those are claims that I would, in those claims I would certainly defend those claims. To my mind, it is crucial to recognize that salvation history under God's providence is not solely a linear track or a zero-sum game in which whatever one people claim must be taken away from another people. In God's providential plan, there can be diverse and overlapping covenantal instantiations, so that the claim to be new doesn't mean not old, and even more, does not mean that whatever is not new must simply and sadly be old. In God's providential plan, new and old cannot be merely juxtaposed, even if there remains a place for these expressions. And I scrawled some notes in pen here, which I don't think make any sense at all. I'm going to read the little notes I scrawled in pen. I apologize for not making sense. But I say that rabbinic Judaism and Christianity supersede the religion of biblical Israel. That is the case. But nonetheless, Jewish continuity with the Hebrew Scriptures and with the people of Israel is a continuity that includes a certain discontinuity, but nonetheless remains continuity. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think anyway, it was there in pen, so I mentioned it. Professor Oliveira generously commends my book for its willingness to honestly express personal, quote, personal convictions on sensitive theological matters, even when this might prove controversial, end quote. He'd suggest some areas where I might adjust or change my convictions in order to make them richer, and also in certain ways perhaps less controversial. On various crucial exegetical matters, he argues that I could have benefited from working more directly with the Greek text of the New Testament and perceiving more acutely what it says and does not say. In his view, my book has not appreciated fully enough recent exegetical insights that challenge standard Christian understandings of Judaism and Christianity. Professor Oliveira, like other important scholars such as Mark Manus, Matthew Thiessen, and many others, is not a Messianic Jew, but offers exegetical arguments that support some of the main convictions of contemporary Messianic Judaism, especially as found in the impressive work of Mark Kinzer. I consider it to be among the main deficiencies of my book that it does not address such exegetical arguments adequately, or in many cases at all, even if Professor Oliveira and I would like to continue to disagree in the conclusions that we reach. Now, Professor Tapie is much more of an expert on Catholic-Jewish dialogue than I am. His words of appreciation, therefore, are much appreciated, and his questions, of course, are profound. Now, I have written a few more things in pen, so you're going to have to excuse me, because here it goes again, and this time I really can't see quite what I'm saying. Okay, so I say that when I'm talking, I'm going to address just really briefly the issue of invincible ignorance. Well, when I think of this phrase, I think not so much in terms of morality and conscience, but in terms of the theology of faith, traditional Catholic theology of faith and non-belief. And when I address this in the book, I talk about the example of how Jews may assess, in some positive way, the Christian worship of a man. The question is, how is that not idolatry? How from a Jewish perspective, which does not hold that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, how could, from a Jewish perspective, could one assess that worship that Christians give to Jesus of Nazareth, the man? And I suggest in the book that in some way ignorance has to be the road. It's essentially that Jewish thinkers would have to think that Christians essentially mean well, but are in some way ignorant of the actual reality. Okay, and so another question that I have written in pen here, another issue that Matt raised, Professor Tapie, is how can God will that A, Jewish practice comes to an end in Christ, and B, that Judaism or Jewish practice continue after Christ? And my answer to that would be, at least according to what I wrote here, is in one sense A, but in another sense not A. That was my, I was trying to, my analytic philosophy friends talk like that, and they think that they make sense. So my point would be that in one sense, God can will that Jewish practice come to an end, but in another sense, He doesn't will that Jewish practice come to an end after Christ. And an example of this, but I'm not too sure how good an example that I just thought of and may need to retract, is how can Jesus proclaim that A, the eschaton is imminent and about to come in the lifetime of His hearers, and B, prepare His followers for a lengthy new Exodus? And I think the answer is A and B. Again, Jesus can do that. There may have been a strong rejection from someone like that guy. So on that note, let me go on to just say that I'm in Professor Tapie's debt for helping me to get the book, especially the early parts of the book, to its current state. It was much worse before his help, for which I'm so grateful. But he is certainly not to blame for his deficiencies, and I very much look forward to continuing to be instructed by him, and indeed by all who take an interest in these matters. Thank you so much.
So without further ado, I would like to open our conversation to you all. And I invite you to stand, state your name, and address a question to our panelists and identify the person to whom you are directing your question. And if no, yes.
My name is Joseph Culbertson. Thank you all so much. My question is both to Dr. Levering and Professor Ticciati in different ways. Professor Ticciati discussed Dr. Levering's characterization of the church's view of itself as Israel and the Jewish people's view of themselves as Israel. It seems like, if I'm hearing his response correctly, that he has an intention to hear the Jewish perspective, in a way that's honoring and learning, but continue to hold to the Christian perspective as his view of truth. And correct me if I'm wrong. Whereas what I hear from you is, and I certainly may be wrong, but I'd like to know that. Are you advocating for what might be called a type of philosophical relativism? In other words, which might be essentially a rejection of an underlying truth by the affirmation of multiple contradictory truths. If not, can you please correct my perception?
Thank you. Great question. And I'm pleased that you've heard it that way. I don't want to end up there, but I can quite see how one might deduce that. So I guess the eschatological frame of what I've said is really important, because I do think something will turn out to be true at the eschaton, but we have a finite grasp on it in the present. And so one has to hold on to one's commitments within that finitude in the way that one can, but only with the kind of fallibility that's possible in the present. So it's not to say it's all equal, but it's to say, given the finitude of my perspective, I have to be open to other finite perspectives, and that being open to them may well result in my changing of mind and admission of wrongness. So it's about the manner in which we hold our truth claims. I think it's important to be bold, strongly committed, and embracing of a certain fallibility. And that sounds like it's a really hard thing to do, but actually I think it's something that we do naturally all the time. I mean, we're constantly acting on things that we hold to be true. Doing anything at all requires having certain commitments to certain truths. And at the same time, I think it's very rare that we would come out and say, there's no possibility of my being wrong here. We sometimes act as if we can't be wrong, and that's when we close the door on any dialogue with someone who might have a different perspective. So I guess that's how I'm trying to avoid relativism. I think one can do it differently from different traditions. The Christian framing of that non-relativism is a kind of eschatologically oriented one. So it's faith versus sight, if that makes sense. Does that help at all?
Very much, thank you.
And thank you so much also for that question. And I think in this, I would certainly agree that I want to very much hold to the fallibility of my book's interpretation of Jesus, for example, of Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. So in terms of my own interpretations, I feel very strong in the sense of finitude and fallibility. But then in terms of the church's, as I see it, the church's spirit-guided, dogmatic teachings about Jesus. For example, that, for example, the Council of Nicaea or whatever,
these are things that I feel like are given in divine, they're given that pertain to, the churches, essentially the truth of mediation and divine revelation. And so I don't feel there that, I feel there that that's kind of an added element. It's essentially talking about like how divine revelation is mediated through the people of God and that element. And so there I feel that since that element, in my view, is spirit guided, or the Holy Spirit is guiding that development, there I feel that the point about human fallibility and finitude is less determinative there because there you have the authority of the Holy Spirit, the authority of God guiding the mediation of divine revelation. But I do think that Professor Ticciati and I are basically on the same page. Now there are Catholic theologians who adopt the view that Professor Ticciati is advocating. So, but nonetheless, I think we're basically on the same. We're certainly on the same page about my own book's interpretation. So that's a key point.
Thank you.
Mark Kinzer.
Louder.
Mark Kinzer. I just wanted to ask you, Matthew, about one of your final points. I think responding to, I think it was to Matt, which was about the A and not A. As you said, I think one can make such claims in a certain sense A, in a certain sense B, or not A, and have it be intelligible if you can in some way at least gesture towards what the difference in senses is. Could you comment on that in relationship to the Torah Jewish practice? What is the difference in sense? What is there? Can you at least point to say something about what distinguishes these two senses, in the sense in which A is true and not A?
Okay. Well, that's a tough question there because I only got as far. I always thought that in analytic philosophy, all you have to do is say A and not A, and then it's all So I think in trying to answer your question, I think other people could answer the question better than me, but in trying to answer the question, I would think in terms of God's will for the ongoing existence of the Jewish people. By ongoing, I just mean the Jewish people who are not who as we see did not accept the Messiah. That's what I'm referring to. And so their practice and their spiritual fecundity and vibrancy over the centuries, I think that God wills that in a positive way. And so then the difficulty becomes, well, how is it then that I think that God in any way wills that Jesus bring these practices to a fulfillment, a transcendent fulfillment, and a messianic reconfiguration? And so I do think that, but I do think that God wills that Jesus bring these practices to the practices of his day to a fulfillment, a transcendent fulfillment, messianic reconfiguration. I do think that, but I don't think though that God wills that in his particular providence. In his particular providence, I don't think that God wills that what should happen or what is going to happen, is that there cease to be, Jews who practice Torah. So, I don't know. I know that I'm not answering your question well because I need to prepare for that question well, but I try to answer it in more length in the book. I do in the first especially the introduction in the first chapter. I tried to be a bit more clear. But I guess that's the basic. I could repeat myself, but I'm worried that I would just descend further into the muddle.
Adam?
Adam Bergerman. Thanks to all of you, and I appreciate your thoughts. If I can sort of piggyback on something Mark said, and after that, as you said, I'm already kind of modeling this, I'm sure this is going to help make more models, but the notion of practice as a marker of identity coming to an end leads Christianity to something like ethnic or fleshy, or what's left, and that seems rather a thin form of identity to be left with afterwards. So what is that? I mean, really kind of pushing what Mark was saying.
Okay, well, I think I'm not a very good public speaker. That's the problem, and I'm not very good. I speak through my hands in a way. So I'm better at typing. So definitely, Adam, I love your work, and I hope you send me an email, and then I can type out a response. That might be better. But the basic thing is that I don't think that God wills for the people of Israel, the Jewish people, the people of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so on. I don't think that God wills for those people to come to an end. I think that God wills for rabbinic Judaism and so on. I think that there is sure that in some sense there is both Christian and rabbinic Judaism supersede what was before. I understand all that, but I still think there's a certain continuity as well as discontinuity. So, but I don't think that people comes anyway. So so that would be, I guess, how I would answer the question is that I don't think there's any thinness at all. I think that. So now the issue though is that I do think this other thing. Remember, I think the other thing that I believe is that God wills that Jesus fulfill and messianically reconfigure, all that came before him. And so, and to do so on behalf of everyone, and so I believe that too. So then the question is, well, how can I believe both of those things? Well, it's because I believe that both of those things are present in God's providence and His positive purposes. But to articulate why that is so and so on and how the two things relate, well, again, that's also going to depend on God's providential purposes as I see it. But anyway, that's part of the answer. But I think other people can answer better than me for sure.
Can I add something to that? I think it's important to also recognize that the Catechism of the Catholic Church points this direction that Matthew actually is going when it speaks of the hiddenness of the drama of salvation in regard to the people, Israel, and the question of unbelief. And so there's a sense in which the territory we're working with, as far as from a Catholic systematic theological perspective, is malleable. And this is like, I think a heavy-duty ongoing construction project.
Holly?
I'm Holly Taylor Coleman. I'm 100% not letting you out of this muddle. Not. I mean, not 1 inch. Because that's right. That is the way the Catechism indicates. But then I'm pretty sure that figuring out the next steps is why they pay us all the big bucks, right? And that's our job.
They pay the big bucks.
Yeah. So now I'm going to have to ask you further. I'm really just trying to clarify. Maybe you don't know, but I'm really trying to clarify what you're saying. Are you saying that an individual who is baptized into the death and resurrection of Jesus will and should, and a community of such people will and should see their form of Torah observance reconfigured? Necessarily, we'll see that reconfigured. But at the same time, God positively wills an ongoing community of Jews who have not thus been baptized?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay. Perfect. Well, that's it's just going to move us. It's going to move the goalpost to another interesting feature of God's providential will, which is that God is going to, I believe, will the baptism. Let's just say that saving faith in one Jesus, and not will that also with regards to some subset of Jewish people?
Oh, see, I would assume that history speaks for itself. I mean, I would assume that if God had will, then God could have done. In other words, like what God, I would assume that God could do. God could, have things could have been otherwise or whatever. So.
But what I mean to say is that if we were talking about, I'll make the comparison to an individual non-Jew, an individual from the nations.
Mm.
The Christian belief, Catholic and otherwise, and generally, certainly traditionally, is that God wills the baptism of that individual. God wills that she come to a reconciliation with God in Christ. And so maybe maybe I'm just opening up a vista into another, a whole set of questions about the difference between what it is to be an individual who is wandering in from the nations and one who is a member of God's chosen people, and we'd have to, flesh that out too. But what I'm saying is that with regard to that individual, there is no, of course we can talk about different senses of God's will, et cetera, but we don't have the same ambiguity. We believe we know what it is that God would will.
Well, sort of saying, I do get confused about the marriage, but it does seem to me though that in one sense, so sense A,
yes.
That God wills that all of humanity, be perfectly united to Him in Jesus Christ. I mean, I think that's a Christian confession. But I do think, though, that in another sense, since not a, God wills religious diversity. You were talking about the nations. And so I'm not at all committed to saying that God does not will for there to be no Buddhism, no Hinduism, no Islam, no anything else. I feel like that's way too strong a claim for me. I'm actually committed more to saying that yes, in some positive way, God wills religious diversity. But then I also say that in another way, God wills this union of all humankind in Jesus Christ. But so I don't really I don't have the now Israel is obviously a very special case of this, and I'm not trying to put everything on the same level. But what I am trying to do though is say that you can say that God wills things in one sense, but doesn't will things in another sense, and history kind of tells the tale as it were. So I'm persuaded personally that if God had willed for there to be no religious diversity, then I can think of many ways that God could have accomplished that. For example, putting up, I don't know, something silly, like putting up, having the stars form the sentence, no religious diversity, or something. I'm just joking, but I assume that God can do these things. That would be part of my understanding of God's power. But God's will and God's power are different things.
Yes.
Justin Bronson Barringer. This one might take us a little far afield, but it's AR, so that's inevitable. I was thinking about this as the discussion's going on and looking around this room and thinking on Black liberation theology and how a lot of black liberation theologians say they identify more closely with the Jewish people, especially in the Exodus story, than they do with white Christians. And so I wonder if they might provide us some way of bridging some of these gaps that seem otherwise too big for us, or you know, these chasms that are otherwise difficult to bring together. So I think of course, the friendship of Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel, or Byron Brosnan and Stanley Levison, all these kind of folks. And so I just wonder if any of you have any thoughts on that, especially given that I don't see any African American or black folks in the room. What might be drawn from that well to bring this discussion to another place that might be helpful? And that's for anyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to note that our fourth annual meeting, which took place online, the topic was Supersessionism, Nations, and Race. And we addressed some of the issues that are hovering in the background of that question. All of our meetings, with the exception of the first meeting, have been recorded. I want to thank Eric Matson for recording this session. It will be eventually available on our YouTube channel. And so all, the meeting, including last year's meeting on Supersessionism, Nations, and Race, at which Willa Jennings was one of our contributors, addressed some of the issues implicit there. I'm going to take an occasion to address a question to Matthew. Oh, did I miss somebody?
Well, I just wanted to answer his question.
Oh, sorry about that.
If that's okay.
Please do.
This is a really difficult one. I'm glad you raised it. And I'm thinking on the who here, so I might want to think differently later. But I'm wondering if this is quite a good test case for thinking through externality of traditions to one another versus how you might perceive others from a different tradition within one's own. And I think one can push both ways in this case. On the one hand, if one's thinking externally, here we've got new unfolding historical circumstances which throw up convergences between different traditions. So black liberation theologians finding something which resonates in persecuted Jewish people, and theological insights coming out of that kind of convergence. Sorry, I did that before. One can narrate that entirely as something which sort of arises out of new circumstances that bring out new precedents. On the other hand, the way Jennings and others tell this story could open up a much more internal way of talking about the story. So if supersessionism is at the root of the category of race, such an interesting claim, then there's various directions that one might push that in. And so one might think of black liberation theology as connecting one back much more significantly in terms of a sort of historical link to aspects of Christianness which have been lost, or aspects of Christianness which were not pursued, which might have been pursued if the supersessionist move hadn't been made so fully so early on. That's a fascinating thing, and that's a kind of internal Christian way of having to rethink.
Kendall, can I just say quickly also, J. Cameron Carter's book is the absolutely quintessential book on that, so I just want to throw out J. Cameron Carter.
You may need to speak that. J. Cameron Carter's work is being referenced as addressing that. Well, I'm personally of the mind that however wonderful sessions such as this shouldn't go more than 2 hours. And we've reached 2 hours. So I'd like to invite you to join me in expressing appreciation to Matthew. The Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology has a very low bar to membership. You can join as a member or as a friend. Friends simply support the mission of the Society without necessarily agreeing with anything that we do. So if you're interested in getting emails about future events, we have a conference planned for the spring, which will be a Zoom event. We have our 6th annual meeting in preparation for the fall. Do join the Society. You'll find us online, Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. Get on on our listserv, and we will keep you up to date with future events. Thank you very much.